Welcome to the Right Science Daily Revision Boost. First thing is congratulations to our top 3 scorers from day 4, which were Ravina and Aoife, who both got the joint high score, closely followed by Fatima. So well done, let's see if you can do it again. Today's daily formula is for work done. So work done in joules is the force in newtons times the distance in meters. Today's biology blast is photosynthesis. First thing we need to know is how these things get into our plant. So hopefully we remember carbon dioxide from the air enters the plant through the stomata by diffusion. Water will enter from the soil by the roots by osmosis. When we've got those inside, we've got the process of photosynthesis that takes place, and that happens inside the chloroplasts, which contain chlorophyll, that green pigment to trap light energy from the sun. Photosynthesis itself is an endothermic reaction that occurs in 2 stages. Stage 1, the light-dependent reaction. This is where energy from the sunlight splits water molecules into oxygen and hydrogen ions. And then stage 2, the light-independent reaction. Carbon dioxide combines with hydrogen ions to make glucose. Make sure you know both the word and balance symbol equation for photosynthesis. So 6CO2 plus 6H2O makes C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus 6O2. 6 is in front of everything except the glucose. In terms of what we use that glucose for, we may use it in respiration, it may be used to make cell walls, it might be used to store food as starch. One of those assessed practicals is involving photosynthesis and how we test our leaves for starch. So you take a leaf, put it in a beaker of boiling water to kill it, place the leaf in the boiling tube containing ethanol to remove the chlorophyll. Then we place the leaf and the ethanol into the boiling water for 5 minutes, making sure the Bunsen burner is off, obviously. Then we'll wash our leaf and spread it out on a white tile before adding iodine to reveal where the starch is. Key thing to remember, we de-starch our plants before doing any photosynthesis experiments by keeping them in the dark for 24 hours. 4 key experiments we could do here. If we want to prove chlorophyll is needed, then we use a variegated plant because they're the ones with chlorophyll in some places and not others, and then we test for starch as already described. If we want to prove light's needed, cover part of the leaf with card before we do the starch test. If we want to prove carbon dioxide is needed, we cover the whole plant with a polythene bag and add a pot of soda lime to absorb any carbon dioxide before doing the test for starch. And if we want to prove oxygen is given off, we use pondweed and then we test the gas that we've collected. We do have factors that will affect the rate of photosynthesis, and we refer to these as limiting factors. There are 3 we need to know: light intensity, carbon dioxide concentration, and temperature. You do need to know the graphs for each of them and to be able to explain. Remember, wherever the 2 graphs for light intensity and carbon dioxide plateau, so go horizontal, it's another limiting factor that's interacting there. When we come to the temperature one, slightly different because photosynthesis is an enzyme-controlled reaction, so our explanation is just that for any enzyme-controlled reaction. As we increase the temperature, initially we give the particles more energy, therefore they're more frequent successful collisions, and then as we go past that point there where it drops off, that means we're denaturing the enzymes. Active site changes shape, substrate no longer fits. One basic experiment we do with photosynthesis is using pondweed because it gives off bubbles of oxygen, which allows us to work out the rate in one of 2 ways: count the bubbles or collect the gas in a measuring cylinder. Obviously counting bubbles not that accurate, bubbles are different sizes, human error on missing them, etc. So the gas in the measuring cylinder is more accurate. If we want to investigate light intensity, we put the light source at different distances to our pondweed before measuring the gas. If we wanted to measure the carbon dioxide concentrations effects, we'd add different masses of potassium hydrogen carbonate to the water. And if we wanted to investigate the temperature, we'd place the equipment in a water bath at different temperatures. Higher tier only bit now, folks, so if you're doing the foundation tier, just switch your brain off for a second. When we're looking at a higher tier interaction of limiting factors, we need to know the inverse square law, which is that when you double the distance from a light source, the light intensity decreases by a factor of 4. So we can write that as 1 over d squared. Don't forget today's daily formula: work done in joules is the force in newtons times the distance in meters. Today's chemistry check, we're going to be looking at types of bonding. First thing, when we're looking at metals and non-metals, we need to know a few key properties. So the physical properties are characteristics that can be observed or measured. So things like they're shiny, they're solid, they're malleable, etc. And non-metals would be dull, brittle, poor conductors. The chemical properties would be characteristics that can only be determined by studying the chemical reactions. So we know that metals lose electrons to form positive ions, whereas non-metals gain electrons to form negative ions. We know that metals and non-metals react with oxygen to form oxides, and if we dissolve them in water, metal oxides produce an alkaline solution, whereas non-metal oxides produce acidic solutions. When it comes to looking at the periodic table on your datasheet, hopefully we remember those two key facts. The periods are the horizontal rows and the groups are the vertical columns. Any elements in the same group have similar chemical properties because of the arrangement of the electrons. And remember, the group number tells us the number of electrons in the outer shell. When it comes to drawing electronic structures for an atom, we need to remember these 4 main rules. First shell can hold a maximum of 2 electrons. Second and third shell can hold a maximum of 8 electrons each. And our fourth shell can hold a maximum of 18 electrons. So you draw it as I have on the right there with the little crosses to represent the electrons, and then we write the electronic structure as 2.8.1. So number of electrons in the first shell, dot, number of electrons in the second shell, dot, number of electrons in the third shell. Remember, when we see the electronic structure, that last number tells us the number of electrons in the outer shell. It also tells us the group number then. We can also work out what period it's in by the number of numbers there are. So in this case there are 3, so it's in period 3. First type of bonding we're going to look at is ionic bonding, which happens between a metal and a non-metal. So for ionic bonding, we're going to transfer an electron from the metal to the non-metal, and as a result we form either positive or negative ions. When we're drawing ions, don't forget to put them in the square brackets and include the charge: positive, negative, single, double, whatever it may be. This just shows you how to set it out when they ask you to draw a dot and cross diagram to represent the ionic bonding between lithium and chlorine. So we start off with our lithium and our chlorine atoms. We then draw a little arrow to show that one of our lithium electrons, the one from the outer shell, is going to be transferred to the outer shell of chlorine. And then we draw our 2 ions on the right hand side in the square brackets: lithium, single positive charge, chlorine, single negative charge. And that gives us LiCl. 1 positive to 1 negative means 1 lithium joins to 1 chlorine. When we've got an ionic compound, then it forms a giant ionic lattice, which is shown on the right there. So all of those positive and negative ions are held in place by ionic bonds. And these ionic bonds are strong electrostatic forces of attraction between oppositely charged ions, so a positive and a negative. Second type of bonding is covalent bonding, which forms between 2 non-metal atoms. A covalent bond is a shared pair of electrons. So a couple of things to remember when we're drawing them. Number 1, make sure our circles overlap. And then you make sure you use a cross for one and a dot for the other. Even when they're the same, like hydrogen on the right, one's a cross, one's a dot. Covalent bonds are electrostatic forces of attraction between the nucleus of each bonded atom and the shared electrons. And they are strong bonds. So covalent bonds are strong, but intermolecular forces between these molecules are actually weak. Hopefully you still remember today's daily formula. Work done in joules is the force in newtons times the distance in meters. Today's physics prep, we're going to have a look at forces in action. Hopefully we remember we got 2 types of material: plastic or elastic. Plastic materials are the ones that do not return to their original shape once we remove the force. Elastic materials do return to their original shape when the force is removed. When it comes to looking at a spring that we're stretching by adding different masses, then what we find is that when we plot our graph of force against extension of a spring, it's a straight line up until that certain point called the limit of proportionality. So the force and the spring have a linear relationship until that point. The spring's got what's called an elastic limit. So below that, then the spring will return to its original length when we remove the force. Beyond the elastic limit, then the spring is permanently deformed. When we're talking about a gravitational field, that's a region where a mass experiences an attractive force. And the gravitational field strength or gravity constant, known as G, is a measure of the force on a 1 kilogram mass when it's in a gravitational field due to another mass. First thing to remember is that mass does not change, but the force on the mass depends on the field. So don't mix up weight and mass. Remember, mass is the amount of stuff something is made from. Weight is the actual force acting on that mass. What we find is the force acting on an object in a gravitational field is larger if either the mass is larger or the distance between them is smaller. Anytime you lift an object in a gravitational field, you are transferring energy to a gravity store, which is called gravitational potential energy. And the gravitational potential energy will depend upon the mass of the object and the height it is. For those of you just doing combined science, then you can skip on to the end of the video to go on to the Socrative quiz. If you're doing the separate sciences, so doing GCSE physics, you need to know the next bit too. So when we're talking about turning forces, there are a couple of key terms. The pivot is the point about which the forces act to produce the turning effects, and the moment is the turning effect of a force, which can either be clockwise or anti-clockwise. The moment itself depends upon the size of the force and the distance from the pivot to the point the force acts. When we're referring to a lever, that's a rod or other object that won't bend that has a pivot. So when we apply a force at one end, it produces a force in the opposite direction at the other end. So we can use it to transmit a rotational force. If we're talking about a force multiplier, this is a factor that greatly increases the effectiveness of a force, and a lever is a good example of this. When we're talking about the effort, that is the force that you're exerting on the lever, and the load is the force you're trying to move. The idea behind these simple machines is to give you something called a mechanical advantage. So the ratio of load to effort is the mechanical advantage, and we can work it out by doing the load divided by the effort. So the work done by you is equal to the work done on the load. For the last time of the day then, our daily formula is work done in joules is the force in newtons times the distance in meters. Now we've had a quick recap, then head on over to socrative.com and test your knowledge on the topics from today. The room name you need to enter is Right 2662. Good luck! If you've been unsure on any of the topics we've gone through today, then the biology blast for the day on photosynthesis can be found in B1 in more detail. The chemistry on bonding is in C2's playlist, and our physics is in P2's playlist.